Well, Kamala Harris delivered her big acceptance speech, but did it win over any voters? Or will those pesky voters actually want her to mention a policy at some point? Well, we'll talk about that. Plus, Joe Scarborough assures you that all this socialism you're seeing from the Democrats, well, their heart's in the right place. That's just pragmatic policies. That's Joe Scarborough talking. We'll analyze where he's gone. And Elizabeth Warren gets into a throwdown on CNBC about her lies regarding price gouging and corporate greed. And it didn't end well for the fine senator from Massachusetts. And finally, we've got some disciplinary action at the Secret Service. Or do we? We'll find out about that as well. Plus a special guest, a surprise. It's Taylor. No, she's not going to join us at all. But we are joined by Akash Chougule from Americans for Prosperity, political communications expert Sarah Selip, and national security and military expert from WorldStrat Jim Hanson. We're brought to you by Americans for Prosperity. I'm Larry O'Connor, and this is the Roundtable. Well, last night was the final night of the Democratic National Convention. Kamala Harris accepted the nomination that no one actually voted for. And it took Scott Jennings, who we've become great fans of over here at CNN, to sort of say what everybody's been thinking about the speech and about this convention. Here's Scott.
I think you're going to have a hard time saddling her in the way that you guys are hopeful that you can.
Well, she still flies around on Air Force Two. I mean, but that's the race, and it's going to take place in a truncated period of time. Can she get away from him, or can Donald Trump and his campaign apparatus drive home the point that there's no blank slate here, that this is a person who's been right next to Joe Biden, executing on the policies that you say have driven you crazy over the last 4 years? And there's really just a simple question for Trump to ask. If you're upset about the direction of the country, maybe you don't put the people in charge who are already in the White House. I don't know who's going to win that race, but to me, between now and the debate on September 10th, that is the argument that's going to be had between these two juggernaut campaigns. The issue you didn't list in your bullets, the economy and inflation, I still think at the end of the day, the people are so upset with Biden and Harris on the economy. If the Republicans tie her to it, all of the other stuff falls away because it's the most important. Republican pushback, and I think there's some truth to this, is that some of this is just substanceless pablum, that there's really no specificity in it, and that they ultimately think they are going to be able to fire her as the incumbent. And I think that's the question that we're really going to be answering over the next couple of months. How far can she run away from Joe Biden to prevent the Republicans from portraying her as the incumbent and then firing her as the incumbent? The country is off on the wrong track. People believe it. They still have economic anxiety. Can she shake off those vibes and replace them with this sort of esoteric unity vibe that they've been portraying at the convention? What she did not do was take any amount of responsibility for her current job, which is vice president of the United States for the last 3.5 years under Joe Biden. There was not an ounce of humility about the inflation gripping the country. She talked about immigration without talking about all the things that happened right up until this border bill that they have hung all their hats on over at the Biden White House. So to me, where the Republicans are going to be headed is all the pablum, all the platitudes, all that aside, you cannot leave the same people in charge. If you believe the country is on the wrong track, if you believe they made all the mistakes on the economy and on immigration, you cannot leave the same people in charge that have run the country off into the ditch. Until she comes up with a good answer for that, which I suspect will have to be litigated at the debate on September 10th, Donald Trump is still in a very good position.
Yeah, Scott Jennings on message. Akash, it is an amazing phenomenon to watch. Do you think that Kamala Harris and the Democrats over the course of the last 4 days have successfully brainwashed America into thinking that they're not the incumbents? Because they are.
Yeah, I mean, there's this interesting dichotomy where she is seen as this glass-shattering new age candidate. And she is, of course, has the diversity to say that she is. But from an incumbency standpoint, absolutely not. She cannot make that claim, and the Democrats in general can't make that claim, Larry. Not only is she vice president, but they've been in control for 12 out of the last 16 years in the White House. And yet somehow they're finding it within themselves to blame 4 years of Donald Trump for every problem facing the country. I don't think the American people are going to believe that substantively. So it really does come down to Kamala Harris's quote unquote glass shattered candidacy against exactly that argument that Scott Jennings is making. Can Donald Trump prosecute the case against her for being the deciding vote for the inflation crisis and for failing to control the border crisis.
Yeah, and a huge part of this convention, which, by the way, is very different than it would have been should Joe Biden been the nominee. Joe Biden would have been running on 4 more years. Things are great. Strongest economy in the world. Don't tell me any bad news. Instead, Sarah, for the last 4 days, we've actually had the recognition and acknowledgement that people are very angry and unhappy, but in some way they're distancing themselves from being the ones who made them unhappy. Are they going to win? Are they going to get away with that?
I don't think so, honestly. At this point, it's just complete BS. Everybody sees through it. You know, we can't pay our 401ks. We can't pay for our grocery bills. We can't even pay to put gas in our cars, yet the Democrats are walking around like everything is hunky-dory. And honestly, it's very fascinating when you see that Kamala is the glass shattered ceiling candidate. She's putting these limitations in place for herself to act like she's doing more than she is. Plus, you're going from the legacy Democrats, the Clintons, the Bidens, the Obamas, and you're going into this new socialist agenda. And it makes a lot of sense now why the policies aren't on her website. They can't just get anything done. They can't figure out their angle anymore.
This is interesting, and I'd love to quick follow up. Are you saying that basically she's her message is, well, you know, I'm the first Black woman to run for president, and we've never had a seat at the table of power, so you can't put this on me, when she is literally the vice president? By the way, at the same time, the president is incapacitated. She's trying to thread that needle?
Yeah, definitely. And you have to think about the fact that she could have done all of this with the stroke of a pen. She, as the vice president, doesn't have the same jurisdiction as Joe Biden. But at the end of the day, she's in power. She has been for the past 3.5 years.
Right.
She's to blame too.
That's
it's not just Biden.
Oh, and forget about, you know, in the last 3.5 years, any policy that she wants right now, it's not like Joe Biden. If she proposes it, it's not like Joe Biden would say, oh, pump the brakes there, honey. We're not going to do that. She can do whatever she wants between now and Election Day. Jim Hanson, there was your expertise in wheelhouse, of course, is national security issues and foreign policy. Not a whole lot of that talked about this week. And is that because they literally cannot even attempt to suggest that what's going on in the world right now is not their fault? Because none of it happened when Donald Trump was president.
Yeah, it's kind of tough when the world's on fire and you're standing there with a gas can to claim that you're not the one who did this. You know, they are the arsonists who started the world on fire. And I think the problem Kamala has, aside from all of the dismal failures they've had in pretty much every aspect of the Biden administration, she actually is on record saying some of the most outrageous policies. She refuses to sit down and do an interview because she's going to have to answer questions like, did you really say you want to seize the patents of drug companies and take over production yourselves? Because that reminds me of seizing the means of production. She said, you know, she wants equity. She wants equal outcomes from government, which is another one of those. It comes from some ideology. We're going to have to figure out which one it is. And she's going to have to answer for all of those when some journalist finally gets her sitting down. But even more so when Donald Trump gets to wave those in the world's face and say, you said all these things. There's video of you saying it. How are you going to walk that back?
Yeah. Karl Marx ideas, but presented in a very kid-friendly Marx Brothers kind
joyously
of
vibe-ish.
Yes, the vibe is there. Well, that's a remarkable thing to watch. And I don't think Donald Trump ever expected, as he was running against Joe Biden, who he's already defeated, now Kamala Harris, that his first task was to convince the American people that he's not the incumbent. But here we are. For 2 decades, conservatives have chosen to partner with Americans for Prosperity to expand freedom and opportunity. AFP's grassroots movement has been delivering real, tangible results at the local, state, and national levels to improve the lives of millions by lowering taxes, removing burdensome regulations, and expanding school choice, just to name a few wins. With more than 4 million advocates and local offices across the country, Americans for Prosperity is the largest, most effective grassroots organization in America. And now AFP is taking on Bidenomics and fighting to secure the border. I want you to see how you can join the movement to reignite the American dream. Go to americansforprosperity.org. That's americansforprosperity.org. Joe Scarborough's a Republican. No, really. Just ask him. It's right there in his bio on the MSNBC website. This morning on his program, he tried to convince all of us that the price controls and central command of the American economy that Kamala Harris is proposing right now, and what Tim Walz sort of already set up in Minnesota, is not in any way socialist. And he would know, because if I can remind you, he's a Republican. So take it away, Joe Scarborough, the Republican. Convince us.
Is that often what's branded as far left and progressive is right in the middle of where so many Americans are. Like, for instance, Tim Walz is being attacked as a communist, as a socialist. Why? Because he wanted hungry kids in Minnesota to have breakfast and lunch at school. Kamala Harris being called a communist, a socialist, a communist, because she wants to make it easier for younger Americans to get that first house, which they cannot get now. Mm-hmm. They are shut out of the American dream that we grew up with. And so Kamala Harris is saying, let's see what we can all do together so younger Americans can get that first home. That ain't socialism. That is pragmatic politics that a lot of Americans support.
You know, Joe, you're absolutely right. Sometimes these labels get in the way of the underlying values that we all share. And sometimes, we find ourselves, defending ideology as if it's just pure when we're all complicated. One minute I may sound like I'm on the far left. The next minute I might sound like T.S. Eliot, depending on what we're talking about. Right. So it's really an indication of how complex everyday ordinary people are.
Right.
And how
it's very complex. And these labels are just getting in the way, Akash. The plan to confiscate people's wealth and then hand out $25,000 to the people they choose to give it to so they can buy their first home, which, by the way, of course, increases the value of every home by $25,000 because we all know they're going to get that money from the government. But you don't want to call it socialism because that just gets in the way. Akash, are we doing this all wrong over here?
To be totally clear, I do think the word socialism and communism probably gets thrown around too much. It does not get thrown around incorrectly when we talk about price controls. This has been tried and failed in every single socialist and communist regime, basically in the history of the world. I mean, progressive economists and writers of the Washington Post were writing pieces titled, "If your opponent's calling you a communist, maybe don't propose price controls." Yes. That's how obvious the connection is. And the thing is, you don't even need to get to the labels, Larry, to see what a dumb idea this is. One need only look at other places where the government has tried this. Look at higher education. Look at healthcare. Just since the year 2000, healthcare costs are up more than 160%. College education tuition is up almost 200%. What do those two things have in common? Government is subsidizing it for more and more and more people to try to make it more affordable, and instead is making things more expensive. And to Joe Scarborough's actual point, Larry, the reason the American dream is out of reach and home prices are out of reach is because of the same inflation crisis that Kamala Harris and the Democrats helped create. Labor costs are up, equipment costs are up, supplies are up, supply chains have been disrupted, trillions of pages and trillions of dollars worth of regulatory costs. I mean, they are the reason it's out of reach for people, and pouring more government dollars, more government control into it is not going to work. We've seen it fail over and over again, and this will be
thank you. I mean, it is accurate to point out that young people right now starting out don't have access to the American dream and buying their first home. But instead of actually solving the problems that are barring them from that dream, they're actually exacerbating and adding to it to make it even worse for the next generation. Jim Hanson, you're a student of history. You've seen how communism has been able to waltz in and take over countries and destroy them. But the important thing is those dictators, just like Kamala Harris, as Joe Scarborough points out, their intentions were great. They just wanted to help people, Jim.
Yeah, I'm sure if they do true communism or true socialism this time, it'll work. And I think it's fair to talk about those two things specifically, because this is the most far left ticket in the history of America. Both the president and vice presidential candidate are far to the left of Bernie Sanders. Now, let's remember, Tim Walz made more than 30 trips to communist China. And upon returning, he lectured students he was teaching that the communist system is just about sharing. And then to make it even better, on the White Dudes for Harris Zoom call, Tim Walz said, one person's socialism is just another person's neighborliness. So I would agree with Kosh that it gets thrown around too much until you get to these two. They have embraced it, and now they're going to have to answer for that. And I think the answer is going to be, you guys are some flavor of commies. Woke is just the newest flavor of socialism. It's replacing class warfare with identity politics. So they are deep in that, and let's hold them to it.
Jim, before you start throwing around any stones, though, I'm pretty sure that one of the white dudes for Harris on the Zoom call had a very similar hat and set that you're utilizing right now. May have been one of the backup singers for Journey, not sure. Sarah, you actually, I think, represent this generation Scarborough's talking about. You are having some barriers to get into the same financial lifestyle that the rest of us have been able to at your age. Do you see Joe Scarborough's point here, that this is the solution you've been waiting for?
No. No. We have to keep in mind that Joe Scarborough is married to Mika. So calling him a Republican is just him cosplaying as a congressman yet again. He looks the part, but he's still spewing the same BS as everybody else on the left. And here's the thing. I really want to buy a house, but I live in DC. So if I wanted to buy a house, I'd have to move to Texas or somewhere that isn't in a metropolitan area, which isn't feasible for what I do. Yeah. And you kind of have to think about like what Jim was saying. When it comes to Tim Walz, he's not the person you think he is. I don't know if you saw this, but on the stage last night, right before the balloon dropped, Tim Walz yanked his neurodivergent son like really hard when they're walking onto stage. It's just like, you can't trust this guy. And of course, you're going to put him in a pretty package. This is such a Democrat thing to do. Everything sounds really good until you look at the implementation. It's, like, look at the Green New Deal. Everybody agrees with like bullet points that might just be the one-liners they'll see on TV. But then you look into the meat of it, the pork, and it's disgusting. You need to think about how it's going to be implemented. You need to look at the process. You need to look at who is putting together this legislation. Yeah. And Kamala and Tim, they're just psychopaths, dude. Like,
they're like, and these policies are economy destroying policies. We've seen it over and over and over again in every country that has tried it, whether you call it socialism, Marxism, or as Joe Scarborough just put it, just really pragmatic ideas where everybody's heart is in the right place. We just want kids to be able to eat lunches, and we want young people to be able to buy houses. I want all those things too. But I know that the solution isn't government to get those things done. An astounding exchange this morning on CNBC between Senator Elizabeth Warren and the panel. Elizabeth Warren was called on to try her best to explain that the new economic policies presented by the Democrats this week in Chicago are very mainstream, very pragmatic, and not socialist at all. And it didn't go well for the good senator of Massachusetts. Watch this.
And that is a time
that's sophistry. Your example on craft. Your example on craft is even worse.
You finished first. In any of the states around the country that already have price gouging laws in place.
Can I tell you why that those are fallacious and misleading at best? And your craft analogy is even. Why can't I tell you? Please let me tell you. Craft, you say, was 440% profit increase. The example you used. The prior quarter from the year before, they had a charge of $1.3 billion, an accounting change which wiped out profits. Then they earned what they normally. Let me finish now. They earned.
You didn't let me finish. Look at the data. Come on. We have economic study now after economic study.
This is the way it always goes.
When there is more concentration,
40 million eggs were destroyed because of avian flu.
When there is more concentration in an industry, we have seen much greater increases in.
Do you attribute the inflation? Market. That's what you think we need to do to solve it?
They're not random. They are not random one-offs. It is part of the problem. When you've got companies that are gouging consumers on prices, consumers need to know they've got somebody on their side.
Senator, listen, we're trying to help. We're trying to actually do.
Where are you in the 37 states that currently have price
Just
gouging
quickly on
laws
that point, Senator
and have
Warren,
used them
can you,
quite
this is Kelly here, can I
effectively?
just
We're never going
clarify how
to
this
be
would work?
This is the way you never lose an argument,
the
because
state-
no one can ever say anything back to you,
The
Senator.
state price
It's
gouging
frustrating.
laws take a
It is frustrating, but frankly, riveting television. And it's quite, I think, revealing, Akash, because they keep making this charge about corporate price gouging, corporate price gouging. You ask for evidence. And as you saw there, she says, well, look at Kraft. They made, 400% profit. Well, first of all, that's not evidence of price gouging. But as was pointed out, the year before, they ended up having to wipe out all of their profits because they lost so much. These year-to-year numbers don't prove that there's corporate greed happening here. But this is how they're communicating their rationale for this takeover of the economy with their price controls. This is the real conversation that needs to be had here, isn't it?
No, you're exactly right. Republicans should be hammering this point home. The American people understand this intrinsically, that corporate greed and price gouging is not the reason prices are up. Prices are up almost 20% since Joe Biden and Kamala Harris took office, because they spent an additional $6 trillion and added $1 trillion worth of regulations onto the economy. It should be no surprise that prices are up. But if you look at food and groceries specifically, Larry, grocery stores have a profit margin on average in 2023 of 1%. 1% profit margin. And off the top of my head, I can name 15 different chains of grocery stores. There is no corporate consolidation like she's talking about. There's no price gouging. This stuff is complete nonsense, grasping at straws. And she's like masquerading as a smart person trying to make this point because they are just so desperate to deflect from their own responsibility. We put out a great report on this greedflation concept at americansforprosperity.org that folks can go in and see this whole claim debunked. But I think the American people simply know that it, on their face, that it is not correct. There's no corporate consolidation and price gouging in the grocery industry driving up food prices. It's just reckless spending and regulation from the Democrats.
It's true. You guys at AFP have been putting out so much great stuff on this, about the Biden economy and exactly how his policies have hurt us. And to believe Elizabeth Warren, Sarah, you would have to think that corporations all were fine. They weren't greedy at all for, the last 10, 12 years. But then as soon as Joe Biden became president, they all decided at the same time, hey, now's the time to price gouge. Is anyone going to buy that?
No, and this is the exact reason why Democrats need to have their policy proposals on, especially the Harris Waltz website. They can't even get their talking points in order. She wasted the hit by arguing with Joe Kernan. It was disgusting. And here's the thing.
Yeah, wait, I want to jump in there because I want people to know, Sarah, you used to be a comms director for people like Capitol Hill. If this was your principal, would you have a conversation afterwards saying, Senator, you didn't come across as well as you want, and here's why?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things you have to consider is you have to keep it short and sweet. I've done this a million times. I used to love putting my Republican bosses on CNN, MSNBC, because it made them better communicators. Right now, we're seeing the Democrats eat their own. And they think it's going to be friendly, it's going to be a softball, but Democrats, especially Harris, they're not showing up for interviews. So nobody knows what to say. And honestly, this hit is the perfect reason to have term limits. She didn't know what she was saying. She couldn't communicate. And her cadence was just so long that she couldn't even get to it.
And Jim Hanson, there's another thing here. I'm old enough to remember, because it's not that long ago. In fact, I remember interviewing at the time about the White House calling this the Putin inflation. This was all Putin's fault for invading Ukraine. Remember that talking point from 2 years ago? First, they denied there was inflation. Then when it was impossible to deny, well, it was all Vladimir Putin's fault and foreign policy was affecting our economy. And now it's corporate greed. It's almost like they're making it up, Jim.
Oh my gosh. No, it's come on. It's the expediency of the moment in a 24/7 news cycle. They assume nobody is paying attention except the few of us who are. And now we get to go ahead and tell them. And again, they're stuck with the fact that they have to answer for all of these bad ideas and bad policies. And Kamala's in the position of saying, if you don't like what's going on, hire me for more of the same. And actually, I'm going to take a rapid left turn to make it even worse. The policies that I support are ones that have been proven for decades, hundreds of years now, to destroy economies. You want to talk about price gouging. We're going to find out under a Harris and Waltz economy what the market value of zebra meat is when we run out of food and they're eating zoo animals like they have down in South America when they tried this. So I don't think they have any option other than to continue to lie. And they have, remember, this is America, short attention span theater is the game, but they have yet to be called out on it. And the fact that people on CNBC and even on CNN are being allowed to question this shows that when they actually sit down for interviews and when they actually sit down for debates or stand for debates, they are going to be hit with their bad ideas. And it's not going to come off even as well as Elizabeth Warren, which was awful.
Hold on. Is that really a thing? The whole eating the zebras in the zoo because you can't.
Oh, yeah.
That would not be the first animal I would go for. I would go for like a gazelle or an antelope. I would think that would be closer to venison, Jim.
I don't know. Yeah, it's a horse. Well, it depends what's left. They probably grabbed the nice, fluffy little venison-like animals first.
I suppose that's true.
Hippos.
Yeah. Leave the otters alone. I love the otters. We should all be eating those pandas, by the way. First of all, Chinese food is always good to eat. And there's a whole lot of fat on those animals. It's going to look. I digress. We promised you that we'd do as much follow-up as we could on the scandal with the Secret Service that allowed the assassination attempt of Donald Trump to get this close to a tragedy. And of course, for the family of Corey Compatore, it was a tragedy. An actual murder took place that day. And the Secret Service, it appears, is finally taking action. Here's the breaking news from this morning about the Secret Service.
We're back with breaking news this morning. NBC News is learning multiple Secret Service agents have been put on leave after the attempt on Donald Trump's life.
Joining us now, NBC's Julia Ainsley. Julia, good morning. What do we know?
Well, we know that there are multiple Secret Service officials who have been put on leave. This is because of this ongoing internal investigation, one of many that were launched in the wake of that July 13th assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania. Among those put on leave is a special agent in charge of the Pittsburgh field office. That was the field office in charge of coming up with that plan that allowed the roof that the shooter gained access to Trump from to be outside of the Secret Service's perimeter. They left that to local law enforcement, and it's not clear that they had any conversation with local law enforcement to make sure that they themselves would be on top of that roof or securing that rooftop in any way. This is something that the acting director recently said he would make sure that if anyone in the course of that investigation were found to have violated policies, that they would be put on leave and that they wouldn't wait until the end of the investigation for that to happen. Now, the exact number, we don't know yet. I'm told it's around 5 or 6. That number could be changing by the day as they continue this investigation. It's not clear if these agents or officials may come back into the agency later on if they've been cleared. But for now, we're told they are put on leave, which is a form of a disciplinary action as a result of their actions taking in the planning and in the response to that assassination attempt on July 13th.
Yeah, I'm skeptical about that report for multiple reasons. I'm not so sure that going on leave is a disciplinary action, especially if it's paid leave. But secondly, I've read Susan Crabtree at Real Core Politics. She had this scoop actually late yesterday. And it appears that the person out of Washington, D.C., who actually was the person in charge of laying out the format at Butler, Pennsylvania, that woman is still on the job. It's only the people out in the field office. It's almost like they're throwing them under the bus to circle the wagons around Washington. Jim, there's a lot of suspicions right now about what happened here, and we're not getting a whole lot of answers. Does this move by the Secret Service help quell people's fears that there's something seriously broken in that agency?
It's better than nothing, but like you said, paid leave just means they're kicking it at home, going to the gym and hanging out. And unless there is actual accountability, right up to the point of the people involved with this being frog marched out of that building in shackles, I don't want to hear about the fact that, oh, we're doing an investigation and these people will not be conducting security until we're done with the investigation, which will almost certainly clear them and try to throw local law enforcement under the bus, which seems to be their plan. Even something more that we heard was damning about the way this went. The Secret Service didn't even bother to pick up radios that the local law enforcement provided them once they got tasked with the outer ring security. They offered comms to the Secret Service so they could tell them. And one of the cops was trying to tell them there's a guy on the roof with a gun The Secret Service didn't have the radios, they couldn't hear. Somebody important needs to be fired, not allowed to resign, not anything else, no benefits, no nothing. There has to be some kind of accountability for almost getting the next leader of the free world killed at a political speech.
Yeah, Jim, and listen, the security issues are your thing. This is what you do and have done your entire career. We're almost 6 weeks from this event, and we still haven't gotten a clear answer about where the buck stopped. Like, as if there's no paper trail on the fateful decisions that were made that day. Are we to believe that this is normal operating procedure for Secret Service?
Oh, there is a paper trail. There's an electronic trail. There's all kinds of things that will say who decided to treat this as if it was, a booth at the county fair, not the former president speaking in front of an outdoor crowd.
Yeah.
So it's available if they want to pursue it. I don't think they do. I think they want to cover it up because this is the most embarrassing debacle in the history of a major U.S. security agency.
Akash, I've been saying for a while now, the American people, I think at this point, they're resigned to the fact that the Department of Agriculture and Education and the EPA, it's glutted, it's bloated, there's redundancy. We probably don't need half of the people, if any of the people who work in those agencies. But we've always felt that certain agencies like the Secret Service, they're the creme de la creme. And now we're seeing them, in my opinion, they're just behaving like another bureaucratic DC agency.
That's exactly right. I think conservatives have actually gotten this wrong for a long time, which is to treat things like the Secret Service and the Pentagon as though they are not also unaccountable blobs of federal bureaucracy. Now, some of the people who do the jobs in these agencies, like any other federal agency, are, I'm sure, honorable people who are doing their best to serve the American people and do the job they're tasked with doing. But to Jim's point, the people creating plans, creating strategies, in charge of executing and communicating, these are higher up people who ultimately are still unaccountable federal bureaucrats. We have seen this time and time again. People recognize the name Lois Lerner, right? She was at the head of the IRS when they got caught targeting conservative groups under the Obama administration. She retired with full pension benefits, despite the administration admitting that they did wrong in that instance. This has all the trappings of a similar situation written all over it, Larry. There's no conspiracy here. This is just the nature of our unaccountable administrative state blob at work, once again, failing to do its job properly.
Yeah, and there's also that guy, Anthony Fauci. He seemed to get a nice little retirement package there at the end of a stellar career, too. Sarah, I'm still struck by the fact that this isn't bipartisan, the outrage over this, even the curiosity over this. Yeah, Democrats played a pretty good game at one of the joint hearings, but since then, they haven't had much to say. The Secret Service is there to protect Democrats, too. And it sort of feeds into, I think, an understandable belief that because Trump was the target, some people in this town were like,
One of the big things for me here, I watched it live, it was a very honorable thing in the moment, but people like the FBI, all of these agencies are looking into it. We won't have a report until October, right before the election at the earliest, right? And I'm a proud Pennsylvanian, a huge fan of the Pennsylvania State Police, local law enforcement, but we need to stop the blame game here. At the end of the day, this happened. Our next commander-in-chief, our former president, was almost killed, like point blank by 150 yards, right? This is just something that needs to be figured out. Democrats are probably just cheering behind the scenes. And, the most fascinating point about this is that Biden took the time to call Trump. And apparently that's all that matters. They did that. Here was this olive branch. What about everything else?
Yeah.
Nobody else cares on that side.
Yeah.
What if it was Biden? What if it was Kamala?
Well, and meanwhile, this week at the DNC, they were right back to the same old volatile, dehumanizing rhetoric about Donald Trump, saying that he was a fascist and a racist, and if he got elected, it would be our last free election. And, there are a lot of unstable people out there who hear things like that, and they think they should do something to stop it from happening. God forbid. By the way, this also comes a day after we learned of another suspect in an assassination attempt against Donald Trump was on the lam. And we're still looking for some of the people who got into the country illegally, Pakistani nationals who are linked with Iranian government officials who have put a bounty on Donald Trump's head. Maybe they should take the protection of the former president a little more seriously. After Rachel Maddow and Jake Tapper spent their time gushing about Kamala Harris's transcendent political performance last night on the stage at the DNC, they actually spent a little bit of time asking the people who really matter, voters. And over on CNN, we got a soundbite from an African-American voter in Pennsylvania that should actually give the Kamala Harris people nightmares.
She wasn't clear enough on the policies. She did speak a lot of her personal history, which was great, but I still don't feel like she's ready. I feel like more so she should wait. I don't want to per se vote for someone that is a backup.
Not ready for prime time. That's not the message I think the Harris people wanted. And Akash, for as long as I can remember, I've seen political pundits lamenting the fact that the American people don't really care about policy anymore. We need to have a serious policy discussion this election cycle. Well, I think Trump and the Republicans are very interested in having a serious policy discussion this cycle, but Kamala Harris is not being forced to do that.
No, you're right, Larry. To be honest, I don't know if Donald Trump is interested in having a serious policy discussion either, but at the very least, as we discussed, he represents a change of direction from the status quo of the Biden-Harris White House, which Kamala Harris does not, right? The American people may not be ideological. They may not know exactly what they want, but what they want is a change of direction in some way, and they want to hear new ideas that they think will give them hope of a better future. She is not offering that at all. She's offering lofty language and shattering a glass ceiling and all these sort of characteristic things, trying to recreate the energy of the Obama campaign. But ultimately, people deserve better than that, even if she won't do it and the media won't ask it of her, which again brings us back to the same point that we have made over and over again. The only person ultimately who can prosecute this case against her effectively and force her to answer questions is Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
He can talk about whatever else he wants, but if he is not hammering her on the economy and on the border, no one else can do it as effectively. And I think it's incumbent on him to do so because she certainly is not making those points clear herself.
Listen, I think when it comes to the economy and the border and national security and Israel, I think that Donald Trump would love to have those policy discussions. And Sarah, I think any observing viewer, like this gentleman that they just interviewed on CNN, if after the 4 days in Milwaukee with the Republicans and 4 days in Chicago with the Democrats, I think it would be a lot easier to tell what the Republicans plan to do should they win the election versus what the Democrats plan to do if they win the election.
Absolutely. I mean, Kamala wasn't even qualified to debate J.D. Vance. And now 33 days later, 10 words. If you stand for nothing, what do you stand for? Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hamilton. So it's just fascinating because, you would want her to take the time to actually say what she wants to do. Not necessarily just like soft launching, but, it's the day after her acceptance speech. The website isn't stacked with it. It's too soon. There were a lot of candidates, and even on the Republican side, who, they backed out because it wasn't their time yet. They're getting ready for 2028. At this time, we're going to see the Harris honeymoon. It's going to be the same thing. She, before this, had never received a delegate in her life. It was a coronation. It was a coup. It was curated chaos by the Democrats. And now nobody knows what they want. And now she's expecting even just the minority voters to agree with her because she looks a certain way. But at the end of the day, she's a far, far left socialist who doesn't even know what she wants. She just wants the presidential nominee.
Jim, she's a former attorney general and a U.S. senator. She's now a vice president, but she's never actually had any serious foreign policy job. I mean, the one job she did have, which was to get to the root cause of the immigration problem and the border security problem, they're now denying that she ever had. Usually when a candidate has that thin of a foreign policy record, they pick a running mate who can bolster that. But instead, she picked, Red China, Minnesota governor, Tim Walz. At this point, after the convention, shouldn't we know a little bit more about what she's capable of doing with regard to national security and foreign policy?
I'm terrified to actually think about what she is capable of doing, with the same mob behind her and actually a lesser quality mob than Biden, who had a lesser quality mob than Obama. There is absolutely no skills in that part of the Democrat Party for foreign policy. So they're toast if they do it. And the idea that Waltz was going to bolster her because, oh, he's a retired command sergeant major who served 24 years in the National Guard and went to war and carried a gun. Except he did none of those, except serve 24 years and retire with one of the lowest awards. He got an award for retirement after 24 years that a Spec 4 with 2 years experience can get for leaving Germany to come back home to the United States. He's incompetent. He's a liar. He does nothing to help her, which is J.D. Vance is going to point out. And she's got no leg to stand on. So the vibe is, and the joy and all of the media hype only gets them to this point. Now they're going to be exposed as the empty pantsuit and the lying poser that they really are.
One other fun thing that happened yesterday is that the rumor mill in DC was going nuts about a special guest. They've carved out time in the schedule for a special guest. And everyone immediately thought, oh, it's got to be Beyonce, which, I mean, that wouldn't have been a big surprise, would it, if Beyonce had shown up? But she didn't. Then they thought it was Taylor Swift, and she didn't. Don Lemon assured us it was going to be George W. Bush. And the fact that people believe that is actually something I think George W. Bush should address, because of course he wasn't there. No, it was finally revealed right before Kamala Harris took the stage who the special guest was going to be.
In anticipation here and elsewhere that there may be a special guest, I am told by Democrats that Kamala Harris was their guest. They did not want a celebrity at the end of this convention to essentially compete with her. One senior advisor telling me this is a deadly serious election. And if you looked at the end of this program, having Leon Panetta come on, the former defense secretary, really presenting Vice President Harris as a plausible commander-in-chief, that is one of the reasons I'm told that there was not a celebrity performance at the end.
Leon Panetta, the man who assured you that the Hunter Biden laptop was really Russian disinformation, he's there to make sure everyone knows that Kamala Harris is a plausible commander-in-chief, because when is he ever wrong? Well, Akash, I mean, did you think it was going to be Beyonce? Or even more importantly, what does it tell you that they had to float this rumor to get people interested to watch the speech in the first place?
You know, it almost makes you believe like they wanted a celebrity there to upstage her to take attention off of her, because then the conversation would be about the celebrity and not about the fact that even if it, if it is a deadly serious election, that we ought to know what the presidential candidates stand for. Maybe a kind of relevant question here. But ultimately, we saw them continue to do what they have done for weeks, right? Which is that they propped her up. She read the speech properly, and the speech was very, very carefully crafted to reach out to the middle and try to build her credibility and all these things. And look, Larry, they are doing what they think they need to do to win this election, which is to keep her very scripted, avoid policy conversations, and hope that her glass-shattering candidacy, again, can be enough to get her over the line. But the American people deserve better than that, and it is incumbent on conservatives to press that case, because Bidenomics has been an abject failure for the economy, at the border, and for foreign policy, and she has been at the helm by the president's side every single step of the way. We have to chart a better path forward and show the American people how and why this administration has failed them over and over again.
We'll have to leave it there, guys. We're out of time, but I do want to let all of our viewers know that on next week's Roundtable, a very special surprise guest. Beyonce is going to, no, she's